Is off. Does anybody still hear music in the background? No. Okay. Thank you. Today I've been finding some strange challenges with audio that I've never had before. Um, so welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a little stretch break and got something, drink of water or something. I want to thank Arnetta and Carl and Kuhn and Irene and Alana and Francis and Jasira for that wonderful discussion. And before I introduce our next speakers, Francis just let me know that she and Jasira want to invite people to take part in a Dementia Friends session that they are going to be holding in Spanish later this month. So Francis, do you want to unmute yourself and just let people know about that?
Yes, Yasira and I are doing the Dementia Friends workshop on November 12th and November 17th via Zoom. I'm writing it on the chat. If you're interested in participating, please send us an email or to either of us, to Yasira or me, so we can send you the link so you can participate. Remember, it's in Spanish, and thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So there, right there is an example of an opportunity to get some training in Spanish. So what I wanted to do now is introduce Jonathan Jackson and Stephanie Monroe and Jason Resendez, who are here with us from Boston and Washington, D.C. And they are going to be taking us through the final part of today's symposium. They are going to be talking with us for about an hour, a little less than an hour, about really the bigger picture, what we can learn from research and from national advocacy efforts about how to address disparities. And then we're going to have about 10 or 15 minutes to hear more of your questions and comments, and then have a little time to wrap up. So please continue to put your questions and comments into the chat box as we go. So I'm going to introduce our three speakers. Jonathan Jackson, PhD, will moderate the panel. Dr. Jackson is the director of the Community Access, Recruitment, and Engagement, or CARE, Research Center at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. CARE investigates the impact of diversity and inclusion on the quality of human subjects research and leverages deep community engagement to build trust and overcome barriers to clinical trial participation. Dr. Jackson also works as a cognitive neuroscientist, investigating the early detection of Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Jackson serves on the leadership team of several organizations focused on community health and has written guidance for local, statewide, and national groups on research access, engagement, and recruitment. Stephanie J. Monroe is the Director of Equity and Access and the Executive Director of African Americans Against Alzheimer's, which is a network of Us Against Alzheimer's, a national advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. African Americans Against Alzheimer's was founded in 2013, and it's the first national network created specifically to respond to the disparate impact that Alzheimer's disease has in the African American community. By working nationally, locally, and through strategic partnerships, African Americans Against Alzheimer's is raising awareness of the impact of Alzheimer's health disparities on communities of color and women, and the need for greater minority participation in clinical trials, and particularly looking at risk reduction as well as finding a cure. An attorney with 3 decades of federal public policy experience, Stephanie is former Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights. Prior to serving in that position, she ended a 25-year career on Capitol Hill after holding a number of key staff positions in the United States Congress. I wonder if this week you've been glad not to be in those roles. It's been very contentious up there on the Hill, but we're honored to have you with us, Stephanie. And then Jason Resendez. Jason is the Executive Director of the Us Against Alzheimer's Center for Brain Health Equity, which is a new center that we are very excited to hear about. And Jason is also head of the Latinos Against Alzheimer's Coalition, which is a network of Us Against Alzheimer's. From clinical trial inclusion to paid family leave for dementia caregivers, Jason champions brain health equity at every level of the healthcare system. The Center for Brain Health Equity is an exciting new initiative, and I'm sure Jason will tell us more about it during our time together. And I'm also so pleased that Brian Van Buren is with us, who is an Alzheimer's advocate. We heard from Brian earlier, and I understand that he may have some comments as well. So Jonathan, can I turn it over to you?
You can indeed. Thank you so much, Beth. And it's a real pleasure to be here. I hope everyone's doing well. I know it has been a stressful few weeks for some and a stressful few years for most. And we are coming to the end of a long day. So instead of having a highly scripted panel, I decided to bring in two people that I interact with on a pretty regular basis to talk about the things that we talk about on a pretty regular basis. And so hopefully we can make this a bit more engaging and conversational. You know, there's one sort of small deviation that I'd like to potentially introduce, and that's if folks have comments or questions or thoughts, please put them in the chat. You know, I think we can try to address some of these things in real time as we're talking, just because I think that at the end of a long day where we have you know, been kind of interacting and corresponding with each other for hours, you know, maybe a little bit more conversation and chat is what we need. So the first thing that I wanted to do though is kind of introduce and orient you to the discussion topic for the next hour. So we're going to be talking about, as Beth said, the bigger picture. We're going to be talking a little bit about the nature of health disparities. We're going to be talking about caring for somebody who's living with dementia, for the autonomy of individuals living with dementia. We'll talk a little bit about research and some of the latest information that we have and whether that appropriately intersects with our ideas of what actually serves as being dementia friendly. But before we get into all of those conversational points, before we get into all of that chat, I did want to turn things over to Jason Resendez. So Mr. Resendez actually has a video that he would like to share that kind of talks, that will, I think, set the tone for a lot of the talking points that we have today. So Jason, if you're ready, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks all for having us. We just held a summit, virtual summit, and maybe many of you participated, and we're grateful if you did. But as part of that, we had what we called moments of inspiration around the importance of addressing the issues we'll talk about today. And folks like Brian Van Buren provided some of those moments, and Dr. Jonathan Jackson. But also, one of our goals was to reorient the conversation around Alzheimer's and brain health from one primarily focused on disparities in health to talk about it from an equity perspective and a civil rights perspective. And one of the ways that we did that was featuring Reverend Al Sharpton. So we want to share a message from Reverend Sharpton with all of you. So please bear with me while I try to share my screen. Here we go. So hopefully you can all hear this.
Well, my mother raised my sister and I in Brooklyn, New York by herself. I was a child of a single parent. And once I was fully grown and on my journey, she moved back south. She was from Alabama. And slowly she began to develop Alzheimer's as well as dementia. And she had two children older than us down in Alabama. And they would call me and say, she's, you know, starting to forget things. And she would leave her house and didn't know how to get back. So finally, you know, I would go down and see her. Finally, we decided to put her in a nursing home. And she didn't even know who I was at one point when I went to visit her. And I think that one of the reasons I'm so committed to this group is that there's nothing that can prepare you for going to see your mother, who in my case was my mother and father, and they don't even know who you are. And we need to take the health conditions in Black America more seriously. We need to be more engaged. When we see that Blacks are twice more likely to face Alzheimer's and dementia, 1 in 3 seniors in this country die from it. This is something that is, as in my opinion, needing a sense of urgency as anything we fight in civil rights. And the race gap in terms of healthcare is something that we should not tolerate as some back page problem. It's a real problem, and we need to deal with it in an aggressive manner. There must be an intentional program strategy that includes everybody, including the poorest and the Black community. Many of our communities don't even have healthcare facilities directly in the community. So you've got to be able to develop strategies that will bring them where the care can be available to them. Healthcare is a civil right. And we need to talk about the disparities there, like we talk about disparities in criminal justice and in business and in employment. We need to first use our platforms to get the message out. Secondly, we need to constantly be on the legislators' backs, because they're the ones that regulate and deal with all of this, to say that part of what they need to know as they deal with healthcare companies and all is what is their plan for diversity? What is their plan to work with those that are in the industry that are servicing communities that have been institutionally neglected?
Still your best friend.
Oh, back to you, Jonathan, while I figure out how to
Still
turn that off.
just move electric.
Okay. Well, we were given I think an early warning about audio issues, and so Beth, thanks for that advance notice. I think there's a ghost in the machine that's affecting us all today. But I wanted to just kind of highlight so many really important parts of that video from Reverend Sharpton. So when we were talking about the importance of recognizing the higher risk of dementia in certain communities of color, we know that in Black and African American communities, it's between 2 and 4 times more likely to affect our older adults. We know that in our Hispanic and Latino communities, it may be 1.5 times more likely to strike. And so we have, I think, a really solemn duty to be thoughtful about the burden of dementia and the opportunities of dementia within communities of color in particular. We know that there are many things that we simply don't know about other underserved folks when it comes to dementia risk. We know that folks who identify as one of the queer communities, so LGBTQIA and plus, we know that these individuals may be less likely to have a care partner or someone that they can potentially interact with and get support from. So when we talk about what it means to have culturally attuned services and care, when we talk about a lot of these matters, we have to recognize what the actual real harms are in this space. So I wanted to actually turn things over to Stephanie Monroe for just a few minutes. So Stephanie, I wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit about what you do and why it's important to focus on the African American presence in the dementia space. So why is this so important? And what are some of the unique challenges that you see with this group?
Absolutely. Well, by way of a little bit of background, I wanted to share that when I began sort of working in this Alzheimer's space back in 2010, little did I know that a few years later, my father would actually receive a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And that my mom's sister would, a few years after that, receive a diagnosis of Lewy bodies dementia. So God had me in that space, I believe, for a reason, to really learn and understand. Although I can tell you that even though I'm sort of professionally involved in that space, when it comes to your family, it's family. And the denial and some of the things and challenges that everyone spoke about on the first half of this call were absolutely applicable to me. And so I really appreciated everyone's comments, which I can certainly say were absolutely applicable, regardless of the fact that my family grew up in Baltimore, not in the Carolinas, that we have, a lot of professionals in our family. We are suffering. We are facing the same caregiving challenges, the lack of paid leave, frankly, the lack of good diagnosis, bias in terms of the first doctor we went to with my dad asked him why he'd want to know. And having to be that voice and that power that pushes through all of these biases and barriers that just come at you. So I really appreciated listening to the first conversation. It's absolutely essential. I mean, we look at African Americans and all of the headway that thankfully we've been able to make through civil rights movement, through slavery, into today, that we don't wipe out all of those gains by virtue of a disease that robs people and forces them into a level of dependence that was never really planned for or expected, or services that are readily available to help families navigate this. It's absolutely essential. African Americans are about 13.45% of the population, yet 20% of Alzheimer's cases are African Americans. Even with those numbers, 33% of the overall cost of Alzheimer's disease are being borne by African Americans. So very quickly you begin to see this disparity, and why does this exist? And how is a community that already is facing so many other challenges now have this lumped on top of them? So our organization, when it was founded, we weren't interested in replicating work that was already being done. We wanted to speak where there was no voices, and we wanted to be the voice of people who were, and I can't just say economically underprivileged, but who were just overburdened with this disease without effective understanding and awareness and accessibility and access to both knowledge and services that they needed to be able to address the issue head on. And so that's what we've been about. We've been about collecting data because we know that data drives a lot of decision making in Washington, D.C. We spent many years out in the field speaking directly to communities, bringing tools into communities for them to be able to leverage to raise awareness in Black American communities. We spent a lot of time figuring out what was the best way of delivering those messages in ways that could be truly understood, regardless of a person's education. We sort of coined the phrase edutainment, that we were going to come out and educate as well as entertain people, but make sure people understood that this was not a problem that they were experiencing alone, that there were in fact local entities that could address that. In many cases, we were the first African-American presence going into the communities to sort of give permission for a lot of non-white or non-Black organizations to actually have access to people. So we served as connective tissue to sort of show folks how you could do it and then what you need to do to try to follow through. So it's still a learning process. I can say that whenever I go out in communities, it's really wonderful. People are, when you give them permission to talk, they are really interested in talking. I think that the awareness in the Black community about that Alzheimer's is not sometimers disease, where sometimes you remember and sometimes you don't. We can actually call it what it is and seek the help and not feel shame, not put that person in the corner as much, but recognize that this is a disease that we can address. And our next step is to really make sure that caregivers, who often become the voice of the patient, the person with Alzheimer's disease, they need a lot of support as well. And we haven't done a good job at really valuing caregivers who care for adults as much as we have caregivers who care for children. So we're trying to even that playing field and bring a lot of those needs out of the shadows.
All right, thank you so much, Stephanie. Jason, wanted to turn it back over to you for just a couple of minutes. I know that you and Stephanie often tout an expression, which is this expression called brain health equity. Can you talk to us a little bit about what brain health equity means? And in particular, I would like, if you could really highlight what equity means as opposed to just equality. So there may be some people here in the Zoom room that might feel, that sure, African Americans, Latinx identifying individuals might have some trouble, but gosh, everybody's having trouble. Everybody's struggling with dementia. We just need to give them the same resources that we're giving everyone else. Is that what is meant by brain health equity, or is there something else that you have in mind?
Yeah, no, great question. I think this ties to really closely to one of the questions that was asked by Don in the chat. Does poverty or socioeconomic stress impact the odds of having dementia? And I'd say research is pointing more and more to the answer being yes. And that's really what is the underpinning of the concept of equity, and for us, brain health equity. So brain health equity recognizes that we don't all have the same opportunity for brain health and for good brain health across the lifespan. We're all born at different vantage points when it comes to the ability to have a high quality education, the ability to not struggle with homelessness, the ability to have income and food security. So it are these differences that add up across the lifespan to erode your opportunity for brain health in later life, and really, again, across the lifespan. So that's what we mean when we talk about brain health equities. We have to recognize that we're not all starting from the same starting point when it comes to brain health, and that we need tailored supports and solutions to address some of those gaps that are beyond our control, that are societal and not within my individual ability to modify. And so when we think about the difference between equality and equity, equality says we all need the same resources, and that getting the same or equal resources is going to give us the same and equal outcome. And we know that's not the case because we're not starting from the same vantage point. And there's a great graphic from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that has that shows the difference between equality and equity as 3 different bicycles for 3 different people. And it, showing that if you have 3 different people that are different heights or different levels of ability, and you give them all the same bike, they're not all going to be able to use that bike in the same way. But if you give them a bike that is fitted to their needs, right, they're able to get down the same path and down the same road, I think, more easily. I'm doing a horrible job of explaining a graphic that I think is really cool, so I'll try to share that in the chat. But I think that's basically the underpinning, is this idea that we need tailored supports and solutions. So at Us Against Alzheimer's and the Center for Brain Health Equity, we're really focused on that idea. Excellent, beautiful, there it is. We're really focused on this graphic, bringing this graphic to life when it comes to brain health messaging. This is a really great time in terms of where research is catching up in Alzheimer's space, to kind of the lived reality around things like socioeconomic impact on our opportunity for brain health. And also around things like risk modification and risk reduction. But we know that messaging and that opportunity isn't being equally distributed to those communities that need it most, right? We're talking about this idea of, Soul Cycle is great for your brain, or Pilates could be great for your brain health. And that doesn't necessarily resonate with all communities, particularly communities who are lower resourced. And so we're focused on culturally tailoring messaging and solutions and strategies to those communities that need them most. And we'll be working with folks like Dr. Jackson, the CDC, and the National Association of Black Nurses, the National Association of Hispanic Nurses, to develop those strategies and make sure that they are equitable and not just equal.
All right, and so I'm going to stop sharing now. Hopefully everybody was able to see that. This was a screen share from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So I wanted to kind of address some of the questions that have been coming into the chat. So first of all, I am going to turn it back over to Stephanie to talk a little bit about community outreach, and particularly the Forget Me Not program. But I wanted to quickly jump in and talk about why risk level is higher in certain communities relative to others when it comes to dementia risk. Now, one of the reasons why people often say that dementia is higher in certain communities is because of comorbid factors. They may say that there's a higher risk of stroke and diabetes, and heart disease in certain communities, and these communities are also at higher risk for dementia. We know that that is part of the answer, but what I think is also important to recognize is that we know that there is more to it than that, and we don't know what the rest of it is. And this is work that I've actually done personally as a researcher in this space, trying to understand and explain these disparities. Where if you take a closer look at the way that we define Alzheimer's disease, in particular the buildup of plaques and tangles in the brain, you could see that the comorbid factors that we often talk about don't fully explain the buildup of these between, say, white individuals and Black identifying individuals. So comorbidities is part of the answer. The other part of the answer is that we simply don't know. And the reason why we don't know is because we don't have equitable participation of all groups in research opportunities. And there are lots and lots of reasons for that. We're going to get into that, I promise. But we have to recognize that the comorbid answer is an incomplete one. And I think it also tends to reinforce individual factors that control and contribute to Alzheimer's disease rather than the systemic factors that really govern it. One more point that I wanted to bring up with regards to Don Pasha's question. We know that poverty and socioeconomic stress have direct impacts on your likelihood to develop something like Alzheimer's disease or any kind of dementia, frankly. But part of the answer is that individuals who are poor or socioeconomically disadvantaged, they are much more likely to live in high pollution areas. And there is new and really convincing research about the environmental impact on your dementia risk. And so folks who live really close to high pollution places like Superfund sites, major roadways, if they live in the wrong direction, but near an airport, the particulate matter that's in the air, especially that small particulate matter, PM 2.5, does seem to be associated with dementia risk. So it's not just a matter of not having resources. It's that these are individuals who are likely to live in places that have high pollution in the air, which does seem to further drive that impact. So there are direct and indirect factors that contribute to dementia risk. So now I wanted to turn things back over to Stephanie Monroe to talk to us a little bit about community outreach, but before COVID, and maybe Jason and Stephanie together can talk a little bit about community outreach during the pandemic. But Stephanie, I would love for you to talk to us a little bit about Forget Me Not. We heard a little bit about it before, but tell us, what this play is about, why it's so powerful, why people seem to like it, and what does it have to do with maybe this idea of being dementia friendly?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I would say there's something magical about the Forget Me Not play, except that it was created with the particular audience in mind. We were intentional about having, frankly, an all-Black cast to go into a Black community, to deliver messages in the way that many of these communities wanted to receive information, make sure that it was full of information, but delivered in such a way that people didn't even realize they were being educated. And we show the truth of what happens in Alzheimer's in a family. We allow the audience to come inside and to ask and have answered questions that they have. We provide them opportunities to connect again to local resources. We humanize clinical trials and bring people up who've already participated in research. We ask the questions about Tuskegee before they have a chance to be asked from the audience. So we try to dispel myths, we create transparency, and we also bring lots of information. So it's just a tool, but we have found it to be very effective. And we were sort of surprised that at the end of the play, people were so impassioned, they so just wanted to do something. And so for us to talk about why, what we needed to be able to find better treatments and possibly a cure, or to even understand why this disease was so prevalent in the Black community, people volunteered. They were like, I want to participate. I'm willing to do this. At least call me and tell me what I can do. They wanted to do something, despite, I guess, rumors or misinformation that Blacks just won't participate in research because of Tuskegee. Well, half the people that we were bringing in didn't even know about Tuskegee. There were other reasons. There was the lack of trust. There was fear. There was lack of accessibility. The places conducting the clinical trials were, 20 miles away. They'd have to maneuver through a transportation system. They weren't getting fully reimbursed. There were lots of factors about it. And so we had to work with the communities and really come in as a listener and partnering with people who were on the ground. But I think it was very much a learning experience for us, from the people on the ground who had an opportunity to connect with real people and for real people to connect with us. So it really was a tri-legged stool. It's changed a bit. We haven't been doing it live, obviously, because of COVID. There are some communities, I think there's a YouTube channel where they play, one of the video recordings is available for people. Some centers are actually running small excerpts of the play in order to facilitate conversations through a Zoom type platform. And so we're working to figure out how to expand that. But I think the lesson learned is that we need to be culturally sensitive to not just what we say to communities, but how we say, and that we're delivering messages to them in the way they want to receive it. Some particular cultures might be very happy to come out or to do a Zoom call with a very learned PhD who's going to speak at a 12th grade level. Others want something that's much more down to earth that they can relate to. And we need both of those things, but we need to understand and take our cue from what the community is interested in.
Okay, so Jason, is there anything that you'd like to add about how we can engage communities and how we can do that with equity and sort of cultural humility?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One is really understanding community, right? So when we do our Latino outreach work, we go into this knowing that Latino doesn't mean the same thing it's not a monolithic community. And I think that's one of the things that you've probably been hearing a lot about with the election results and seeing some of the data coming out. This is something that we've known for, since the existence of being Latino, that we're not all bound by the same cultural values, the same culture and heritage. So really understanding what that means, right? So not just in the Latino community, that's applicable to several communities. So when you're thinking about your outreach and engagement efforts, really understanding what that community makeup is. And this is where data becomes really important and powerful to help you understand what your community looks like in terms of the makeup of Latinos versus Puerto Ricans versus Dominicans versus Mexican Americans, and what is it in your community when it comes to Latinos that are predominant, and then tailoring your outreach and engagement based off of cultural norms in those communities. One example is we have a engagement platform, not as to the level of Forget Me Not. Forget Me Not for us is the gold standard, and I'm always in awe of the amazing work Stephanie's done with Forget Me Not. But we have a model called Who's Your Coco, which is built off of the Disney Pixar Coco film, which has a really powerful theme around memory loss and also caregiving. And it has that theme is couched within the Mexican American holiday of Day of the Dead, or Mexican holiday of Day of the Dead. Not all Mexican Americans celebrate this, but this is a tradition that's primarily Mexican, that if you're Cuban or if you're Dominican, it doesn't have the same cultural resonance. So I wouldn't necessarily go to Miami and expect a great turnout for the Day of the Dead event, right? So it's kind of looking at that engagement tactic and strategy and understanding that that's going to work in certain communities, but maybe not as well in others, and adapting based off of that understanding. So I think it is understanding who your target communities are, leveraging data to understand that, talking to individuals to understand the cultural norms, and then develop your engagement strategy based off of that information. So I'd say really it comes down to nothing about us without us. So having those communities as part of the conversation, like Stephanie did with Forget Me Not, so that they're designing the program development and outreach along with you, And that's going to help to guarantee that success and cultural resonance. And as someone asked about how do we do this during COVID, I think those same lessons apply and are even more urgent during COVID, right? To have these individuals as a part of this process, and then goes to, and I think this is something we say all the time, but it never gets any less relevant, who are the trusted messengers within those communities that are already doing this kind of work, even if it's not around dementia. And this is how we started with the Latinos Against Alzheimer's Coalition. We went to organizations doing great work in diabetes and heart disease and painted the connection between dementia and diabetes and heart disease and said, this is an extension of that work. And that really enabled us to have a different kind of conversation because they were already trusted. They already knew the content from a different angle. So we were able to piggyback and create a new skill set for them around brain health and dementia. So I think that identifying those folks that are already doing the work and figuring out how you can add value to the folks that they're serving with your programming, messaging, resources, et cetera.
There's just one example that I love to share. So often we would go to these community events and we'd have someone talk about nutrition because we know that that's really essential for just in general healthy aging. And we'd have doctors talk about the Mediterranean diet and all these different diets in front of an audience of African Americans who are not Mediterranean. And they're like, what does that mean? I got to eat olives all the time? What are you saying to me I need to do? And we had one doctor who came up and just said, just very simply, just put color on your plate. Make sure you got a little bit of green, a little bit of orange, maybe some brown. It shouldn't be brown with white covered in gravy. That's not the healthiest thing to do. But someone who can really connect and break things down in a way that's easily accessible for people, and then people can implement that. So that's what we need to be, I think, very intentional about, is breaking down the way we share with different cultures and recognizing that you're not going to tell certain communities to never eat this lovely thing that they've been eating forever. You're going to tell them about how to modify that, how to modify their risk, how to add things to their diet, how to add in exercise so that it doesn't require a gym membership, just how to do what you're doing in your place to be able to work on your risk, just in terms of healthy aging. I think some of the data is out in terms of how effective these can be, but we know it certainly makes things easier for people to age and to be able to stand and not to have mobility challenges and things of that nature, which is all good.
And it looks like we've got Mr. Van Buren is back.
Yes.
Mr. Van Buren, before you get started, I just wanted to kind of respond to one of the questions in the chat to Sandy Ryan, who was asking about the program that was coordinated with Day of the Dead. I think, Jason, the program was called Who's Your Coco? And this is COCO, as in the Disney Pixar movie. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And
Okay.
I'll put in the chat a link to an overview of that.
Okay, all right, so Mr. Van Buren, so we're talking about the nature of living with dementia. We're talking about what that must be like, and we're kind of talking about that in terms of dealing with historic and current racism. Do you have any thoughts around these that you'd like to share about your own experience or what you've seen with others?
Yes. Well, one point I want to make is to engage African American communities in the Alzheimer's cause. The Alzheimer's Association is partnering with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME, a predominantly African American denomination with approximately 4 million members in the United States. When it comes to my own diagnosis and process, it was very difficult because, number one, once the doctor gave me my diagnosis, that was it. He did not tell me what to do, did not give me any resources. So I was kind of lost until I was smart enough to get on the computer and just start doing research. And I found the Alzheimer's Association, which really, really helped me get through this process.
Yes, sir. So when we are talking about dementia-friendly communities and being dementia friends, would you say that having a timely diagnosis is part of the problem that we need to solve here? Is it a matter of being taken seriously by your doctor or having different doctors, or what is the dementia-friendly way to to maybe get a more fair and timely diagnosis?
Good question. Well, actually, I am part of an organization now that's looking at dementia-friendly airports. We're based out of London. And for those of you who do not have dementia, you would be surprised how difficult it is to maneuver in an airport. I have problems just getting my ticket from the kiosk. So what I've done is I have a card that explains that I have dementia and what my limitations are. I give it to the customer service rep before the flight. They allow me to board the flight before everyone else to get seated. And then if I'm going to make a connection, they have someone waiting for me to assist me to my next flight.
That's great.
So I guess that brings up another question. So we've talked, effectively all day about these dementia-friendly spaces and how we can be dementia friends. But at the end of the day, in order to do this well, it requires resources. So how can we possibly build a dementia friends program and dementia friendly spaces in communities that are historically under-resourced? So this is for all three of our panelists here. How do we do that? How do we basically create a space that requires more resources, given that they don't have enough resources in the first place?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Stephanie.
I was just going to say, I completely agree about the resource question, but there are some things that I can say from having experiences with my father that are very frustrating. Like, you want individuals to be able to go to a doctor, whether it's for treatment of their dementia or for other kinds of issues. One of the first frustrating barriers that I have encountered is going to the doctor and them asking, Mr. Johnson, have any of your medications changed? Can you give me a list of your medications? Things that I have to remind them, he has dementia. He's not going to be able to answer those questions. They're not really relevant. Find a different way to get that information. So I feel like sometimes being dementia friendly is just not trying to, or not intentionally humiliating people, putting them in a position where they feel very ashamed and they feel, like they're being put in a position of being judged for not being smart or being silly. Just asking the questions that need to be asked and providing other opportunities for people to engage. And I think that's however you maneuver through the community, that you shouldn't always have to have a card or have an explanation. That once and done should be the rule. You should be able to put something in your airline record that's shared. I mean, Expedia gets all kinds of information about your choices and your food and everything else. Your status, you should be able to go in there. I just think we need to be forward thinking and put ourselves or get information from dementia communities about what they really need, what would help them, and that others could be proactive in helping to be accommodating as we do with people with disabilities.
Yeah, and I would just jump in on the resource question and offer two thoughts on that. One, I think goes back to what I said earlier about understanding what's already happening at the community level around maybe related issues, diabetes, heart disease, and are there ways to tap into that infrastructure? That's not the best solution. Obviously, we want more resources. And I think second is, we need to recognize and demand a better public health response to dementia at the state level and at the national level. I mean, the resource that we invest at the federal level in dementia response is laughable compared to the amount that we invest in research. And certainly compared to the amount that we invest in public health response to other health issues comparable to the impact of dementia on society. So I think we have to think about as, we're your service providers, but those services can be better delivered and you'll be better resourced to deliver those services if you also think of yourselves as advocates and as folks that can have a voice to policymakers locally, at the city level, at the state level, and at the federal level. Today, for example, the US Senate Appropriations Committee announced that they were recommending a $350 million increase for Alzheimer's research, which includes a component for the BOLD Act, which is a public health infrastructure project through the CDC, which is great. But the House has a much smaller number that wouldn't include any of that funding for a public health response. So I think there's really an important opportunity here that recognizes the fact that resource and infrastructure is limited, and we need to demand better for our work and the ability to actually do the work that needs to be done.
And we need to resource communities. We need to look at what the data tells us about where people who are most impacted by this disease receive their health care, and making sure that it's not just going to very large centers, but also part of that and the resource accompanying that goes to places like community health centers that are embedded in communities that specifically are created to serve vulnerable communities. Make sure they have an opportunity, that they've got skilled, trained people who are able to get some of this and actually serve people where they are, and not force people to go out of a system that they're already comfortable with.
Mr. Van Buren.
Oh, I'm sorry. One of the points I want to make is that living with dementia does not mean I am suffering.
Mm-hmm.
I live well. I just have to do things much different than before. But many of my cohorts who also are living with dementia do many, many, many things. We just have to adjust it and make it so it fits us. But the idea of us suffering is just not real.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to pull in a few comments and thoughts from the chat. Kristen Weinstock wrote a few minutes ago, I feel like doctors are reluctant to use the term dementia. I'm seeing more docs use cognitive impairment. Does that line up with with your experience, Mr. Van Buren? And Jason and Stephanie, why might this be the case, and what might be going on here? So Mr. Van Buren, do you see dementia more? Do you see cognitive impairment more? Which term do you hear more?
I hear more cognitive impairment, but the reality is that doctors are really afraid to give the diagnosis. I'm not sure. Part of it is I just don't think they're as educated as they should be around this subject.
Yeah, I would agree with that, having seen many doctors in action around this. Jason and Stephanie, what do you think?
I would say the same thing. I'd say it's all over the place because of the level of education around cognitive impairment, cognitive decline, brain health generally. That's a big focus of our work, and a lot of folks in the space, is to increase our health system readiness. And that means providers understanding the nuances and differences between the different terms, which is critical. And today we just had one of our amazing advocates, Yvonne Laddie, who's an Afro-Latina from New York, who helped her mom, a Dominican immigrant, navigate the diagnosis process. At one point, her neurologist gave her a printout of emails and said, Google Alzheimer's. Your mom has Alzheimer's, Google it, was literally the quote that he gave to her. So, it's not just about what terms to use, but how to use them, how to have a conversation. I think that's an important part of being dementia friendly, and why I love the Dementia Friends program. It's because it creates a culture of inclusivity around these issues, and so that we are able to have these kind of these difficult conversations, or often stigmatized conversations. And I would love to see the AMA adopt the Dementia Friends program so that their doctors and providers are considered dementia friends, because I think that's really lacking right now in the health system.
And I would just add to that, having spent some time with geriatrics and individuals in this space, many of them also don't like delivering a diagnosis for which there's no treatment. They don't like delivering a cancer diagnosis if they feel like there's no effective treatment, because as Jason said, they're not used to viewing care support and care planning or connecting to community resources as part of their prescription, right? And so that needs to become part of their normal prescription, is this is where you go next. This is research. Cancer very much makes participating in research part of their care continuum. And we haven't really done that in Alzheimer's or dementia. I mean, people that are older and old enough like I am to remember when you didn't ever talk about cancer, you called it whatever else that thing was, but you didn't want to say the C word, right, because of stigma. And we've got to call it what it is in order to defeat it, and not let it defeat us.
Yeah, and so I wanted to jump in and say that, from the clinician's perspective, cognitive impairments and dementia may be used differently than the way that we use it within our communities. So for some, they may think of mild cognitive impairment, which is a specialized term that people use, which is not quite dementia. It is, for some people, they feel that it's sort of a pre-dementia, but some people never sort of progress from this stage of mild cognitive impairment to dementia at all. So, there are all these special terms of art that we have historically used. And, those of us who are on the side of working with doctors and clinicians, certainly need to recognize that that words have meaning, and they have different meanings for different communities.
Yeah.
So I wanted to actually jump back into the chat. So there are two great questions from Leah Zavaleta. And Leah, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot. If you would be willing to unmute yourself and kind of ask your questions to the panel, I'd love to kind of get a chat going about thinking about community outreach and engagement. Leah, are you still in the Zoom?
Yeah, hi, I'm still here.
All right, go ahead, Leah.
So my first question was, Jason, thank you for, first of all, even mentioning the differences within Latino community, and also looking within the African American community and how diverse it is within what we consider to be such a homogenous term. But how do you also problematize the term community? Because that term is widely defined very differently in every single discipline. Anthropology has multiple terms that we use instead of community now, because it's so tricky. And whenever you do use that term, you have to say exactly what you mean by it and how to qualify it. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that in terms of your community outreach. And then my second question was, within community outreach, how does Western medicine interact with traditional medicine and traditional practices? Do you bring that in? Do you bring in traditional healers, curanderas, whatever the culturally specific or relevant term would be for that group of people? But like, are those people brought in to help with describing what's happening, to help find a path to treatment? Because in my own research and with the people that I work with at my museum, there are people who don't trust Western medicine. They trust their traditional healers. So how do you work on that aspect of it as well?
Yeah, I think those are great questions, and have me in the hot seat. So for the first one, I'd say we don't do enough of critically thinking about either issue. I think for the term community, I think what we do when we're primarily working at the national level, but we do have collaborations in specific communities, as in geographic cities, and within those cities, communities, Latino, African American. And so when we are developing our partnership strategies there, we're talking to community-based organizations and understanding what that landscape looks like and what the ecosystem looks like and how we can add value to that ecosystem. So I think really better conceptualizing community is something that we don't do enough of and should be doing, because I think an interdisciplinary approach is really critical. So it's challenging, I think, to have what is a common vocabulary across disciplines around these terms, and we need to do better at figuring that out. Second, in terms of non-Western medicine, so we haven't embraced that fully. That has actually been brought up several times, particularly working in the Southwest, where folks come up and ask about this issue. What I say we do is certainly not think that all of our solutions are going to be delivered by a person in a white coat. That's certainly not the case here, particularly because of many of the issues that we outlined earlier about the intimate links between socioeconomic issues and dementia risk and access to services and service utilization. So we are big promoters of leveraging community health navigators and community health workers. So that's not, necessarily, I don't think that fits into the traditional term of non-Western medicine, but it certainly fits into the idea of looking beyond the traditional health system to help individuals navigate resources, access services, and learn about stigmatized issues like Alzheimer's and dementia. So I think that's really critical, is the importance of building and investing in community health workers, lay community leaders, building up their health literacy around dementia and Alzheimer's, and empowering them to help the community navigate these issues. And we see some states do that way better than others. Some health systems do that way better than others. And so we have been advocating for a long time for better supports and reimbursement for community health services, our community health navigator services. So I think there's a long road there, but an important one to invest in.
Okay, and then I'm gonna jump in. Usually as moderator, I try to take a back seat, but I think I have particular insight into this question. And I think that this speaks to a lot of the other questions around community engagement. So number one, when it comes to problematizing, I think that's the exact word. Be specific about what community that you're trying to reach out to. And if your community is African Americans or if it's Latinos, that's not specific enough. Just in the same way that if you were saying that we're trying to reach out to white people, people would be like, well, which ones? Similarly, we have to recognize that level of diversity and that need for specificity. The second thing that I would say is that it's not simply enough to be specific about who within a community you're trying to reach out to, but you also need to be specific about what it is that you're trying to achieve. Coming as somebody from the research world where it feels like the only thing that we want is for people to come and participate in our research studies, we are starting to recognize that there are other things that people can do around health and around research that are really beneficial. So you could serve as a study ambassador. You could be on an institutional review board, reviewing the ethics of a study. You can be connected to social supports and services rather than participate in a research study. And we've seen great examples of people who will be able to do this and do this well, either pre-pandemic and during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic as well. So being specific about your audience and being specific about the deliverables and being specific about, being flexible about what people might be able to get out of it and or contribute usually makes this much easier for folks. And it does give you that ability to problematize it. So I actually have like a very complicated, very academic looking multidimensional framework that we could get into if people are interested. But what I want to do is maybe jump into some of the other questions that are coming in. So one of the questions that I saw, I'm scrolling back up through the chat, comes from Amy Walsh, who asks, how do you balance agency without embarrassment for a person living with dementia? So how is it that you can provide some support without infantilizing or embarrassing someone? And Mr. Van Buren, I wanted to start off by asking you this particular question. How do you balance independence and support for someone living with dementia? What is it that we're supposed to be doing?
Come back to me. I have to think.
Okay, all right. So Stephanie, let's talk to you. How did you manage that when you were trying to be a care partner for your father?
So, and we still are. I think letting my dad speak so long as he had a voice, right? Giving him an opportunity, not jumping in ahead because the delay in him responding, for example, if he was being asked questions, it was seconds before he had to be able to respond, and just giving him that ability to do that, or give him prompts, not to be his voice until he would get to the point as he is now where he'll ask me to tell people what it is. So it's sort of respecting where they are. and not being ashamed of where they are and letting them keep their independence and their, you know, selfness, because they're still there, right? Let them express that. I think that's really helpful. And, you know, I have found with my dad in particular that COVID's been hard because of the isolation. I think that makes dementia look worse, but it's amazing how quickly when I will remove him, he's an independent living facility, when I remove him from that facility with my mom, and we just engage in regular conversations, or we're driving around and he gets to identify animals and trees and cars and laugh. He's like, he snaps back. The resilience is there. And just experiencing that and being, you know, aware and with him as he's going through those moments, and not ask a lot of questions that he can't answer. That's how we've managed it.
All right. Mr. Van Buren, I wanted to know if you have any thoughts. I'm happy to come back to you in a few minutes. There's always plenty to talk about.
Okay.
But I guess my question is how do you stay independent? And, you know, how do you define asking for help?
Good question. Many people are surprised that I still live alone by myself and don't believe I should. And that includes my doctor. I solved that problem by getting 2 roommates, Alexa and Siri. Oh, she's talking now. What Alexa does for me is she tells me when to take my medication, what appointments I have. When I come into the house and I tell her where my keys are, which is so different than having to spend an hour looking for my keys. So I will say, Alexa, where are my keys? And she will tell me. I don't think I could live alone without these 2 assistants by these things. So it works.
Great.
That's fantastic. And we I think we have not talked enough as a group about building in different kinds of physical, digital, social supports to you know, folks who are trying to balance that need for some support with the need to remain independent. And I think that's wonderful. So thank you so much for that, Mr. Van Buren. I wanted to just kind of give everybody a chance to wrap up here. There are so many really good questions that I wish we could have jumped in, but let's just go to our panelists and do kind of final thoughts about the need for dementia-friendly communities, about the resources that are you know, coming our way, and about how to achieve brain health equity with some of these infrastructures that we're planning. Where do we go from here? What do we do next?
Well, I'll just start
Jason,
by
saying, go ahead, Stephanie. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just start by saying, you know, dementia friendly communities really help people understand that they can meet people where they are with what they need. And they're not receiving the kind of support they should. They should be getting lots of public and state and public health and other support to really make this a campaign and equip communities to develop not just programs, but to empower individuals to, you know, be their true selves throughout this whole process and this whole journey. So I've been very appreciative. I can tell you honestly that immediately when I heard the term initially many years ago, I was concerned that this would be like settling for dementia, right? Not continuing to power that urgency, like if we were just going to accept it and I just wanted us to defeat it. But now I realize that's how you defeat it. Is, you know, the disease is the enemy, the people are not. And we've got to make sure that people have the ability to really be their true selves for as long as they can. And the dementia-friendly communities can help that happen.
All right, thank you. So we'll go to Jason next, and we'll give our last word to Mr. Van Buren.
Yeah,
Jason, what have you got for us?
The best for last.
Absolutely.
Building off what Stephanie said, you know, I think dementia-friendly communities are so important because the dementia-friendly process gives us a common vocabulary around what people see as a really difficult issue to talk about, you know, highly stigmatized issues. So just that ability to bring it out of the shadows and enable folks to understand that, you know, this is something you can talk about and should talk about, and is something that enables us to, create connections among us. I think that's so super powerful. And as someone, I've been a LGBT activist, and that's one of the things I love about Brian talking about his identity and centering his identity as a gay Black man. In the LGBT movement, one of the ways that we got gay marriage, for example, was by talking about knowing individuals who are LGBTQ. And I think it's the same thing with dementia, and sort of being able to talk about our experiences and our connections and having this common vocabulary and a sense of unity with a disease that's been traditionally, and family of diseases that have been traditionally extremely isolating. So if anything, I think the power of this movement is to address that sense of isolation. And I think that underscores the importance of equity, that this is something that must be shared equitably and must be built equitably. And it's hard because, as we've talked about, the resource issues that Jonathan brought up, you're not getting a lot. I think that's one of the things that I'll take away from this, is how much resource has been talked about all throughout this symposium. We're not being resourced to do this work to the level that we should be. And I know it's hard to prioritize equity when that's the case, but I think it's super critical, super important, and I'll do whatever I can to make sure that you have the resources that you need to do it. So thanks for having me and letting me be a part of the conversation.
Okay, Mr. Van Buren, what would you like us to remember as we think about being dementia friendly?
Well, what I was going to say is dementia friendly is really assisting us in maneuvering through life. My pharmacy had a training about 3 months ago on being dementia friendly. And one of my issues quite often is I will go into a facility and forget why I'm there and what I want. So when they see me kind of dazing, they're able to recognize that, oh, he's having one of those dementia moments. So they're able to assist me. People who don't have dementia don't really understand all the obstacles. Something as simple as walking on a carpet with many patterns is very confusing for me. I have fallen many times, so I have to now use a cane because I can't differentiate steps. So when I step down, I don't realize that there's not a step, or there is a step, and I have fallen and broken my nose, my ribs, my arm a couple of times. So it's very important for the community to educate themselves in terms of what we need and how to assist us to maneuver through this process.
Thank you so much, Mr. Van Buren. And thank you to Jason Stephanie for jumping in and talking with me about brain health equity, about dementia friendly, being dementia friendly, and the resources that we need. I wish we could have gotten to so many more of the questions, but I will say in response to some of the questions, please center health, please center wellness, and that applies for self-care as well as for those of you who are serving as care partners. Please be well in all things. And I'll turn it back over to Beth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Brian. And it's been a pleasure for me to listen to you and to also see the comments and the enthusiasm in the chat. Brian, there was just a message. One of the participants said she could listen to you all day. I wish we had more hours, although I'm aware it's late in the day on the East Coast. It's a bit earlier in Hawaii, where some of our partners are joining, but it's been a very rich, amazing afternoon, and I just appreciate it. I want to mention a couple of questions that came in. My helpers who've been monitoring chat had flagged these, and then I want to say some thank yous, and we'll wrap up. So one point was regarding the challenges in differentiating dementia and various forms of mental illness, and one could even expand that. Sometimes it's very hard to differentiate the impact of dementia from hearing loss, for example. There's a lot of interconnection. And from a dementia-friendly standpoint, I would say the direction that the dementia-friendly movement is going worldwide is to really think of living with dementia as living with a disability, and that could be a physical or cognitive disability. So in a way, part of my response to that comment is that we need to just think broadly about how we make our communities accessible for everybody.
Right.
And then There was another question about community outreach during the pandemic, and certainly it's become so challenging, and a lot of times small organizations are struggling to do really important work in their communities, and the resources needed to kind of pivot to new ways of reaching people. That's a big challenge. But I have to say, I've been so inspired by working with the community partners who you met earlier and seeing how they have gone through a process of often polling their community members to find out what technology people have, and then really kind of trying different things and piecing something together. And in a way, it's similar to what Jason and Stephanie, you were sharing earlier, and this was a big theme in your amazing summit that was just the other week, that we need to think about bringing resources to the communities, not making community members travel to the resources. And I think with regard to technology, we have to think about what are people already using. So a lot of people use the telephone. A lot of people use the television. That could be cable news. You know, some cultural groups use Skype a lot to be in touch with family members who are in their home country. So we need to ask the question and find out, what do people already use and feel comfortable with? It may not be necessarily making everybody use Zoom. But I will say what I have seen is our community partners found their way through. They figured it out, and they have continued doing the outreach and connecting with people, and it's all the more important. So I wanted to just say a huge thank you to everyone. I want to first really thank the interpreters who must be exhausted by now. Thank you to Tina and Terry and Afranio and Brendan and Stephanie for providing simultaneous interpretation in Mandarin, Portuguese, and Spanish. And thank you to Donna for providing captioning in English. Thank you to all of our speakers. It has been a really, really inspiring afternoon for me hearing you. And I just appreciate you're all sharing from your own experiences and expertise. And while there's so much more to say, I hope that this conversation has given you all something you can take back and look for ways to implement. I will email everyone an evaluation survey and would really appreciate your feedback. So please take a few minutes to complete it. Those who are requesting continuing education, it is required that you complete it. And I'm going to be adding in the resources that people were sharing through the chat to our resource list. And hopefully in about a week, we'll be able to post the recordings and the resource list and slides from today. And I will notify you all by email when those are available. So with that, I am happy to stay on. If anyone has last questions that they didn't get answered, I will put up our rolling slideshow again if anybody didn't get a chance to see it earlier. If any of the panelists want to stay on for a couple minutes, that's fine. Please feel free. But I just really want to, again, from my heart, thank you all for what you've shared today. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Beth, and a big round of applause, everybody, to you. This was really awesome.
Thank
A
you.
great way to spend the afternoon. I learned so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Beth.